Section 4 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Wallichem. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 3, by Henry Gray. Development of the Vascular System, Part 2. The valves of the heart. The atrioventricular valves are developed in relation to the atrial canal. By the upward expansion of the bases of the ventricles, the canal becomes invaginated into the ventricular cavities. The invaginated margin forms the rudiments of the lateral cusps of the atrioventricular valves. The medial or septal cusps of the valves are developed as downward prolongations of the septum intermedium. The aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves are formed from 4 endocardial thickenings, an anterior, a posterior, and 2 lateral, which appear at the proximal end of the truncus arteriosus. As the aortic septum grows downward, it divides each of the lateral thickenings into 2, thus giving rise to 6 thickenings, the rudiments of the semilunar valves, 3 at the aortic and 3 at pulmonary orifice. Further development of the arteries. Recent observations show that practically none of the main vessels of the adult arise as such in the embryo. In the side of each vessel a capillary network forms, and by the enlargement of definite paths in this the larger arteries and veins are developed. The branches of the main arteries are not always simple modifications of the vessels of the capillary network, but may arise as new outgrowths from the enlarged stem. It has been seen that each primitive aorta consists of a ventral and a dorsal part, which are continuous through the first aortic arch. The dorsal aortae at first run backward, separately on either side of the notochord, but about the 3rd week they fuse from about the level of the 4th thoracic to that of the 4th lumbar segment to form a single trunk, the descending aorta. The first aortic arches run through the mandibular arches, and behind them 5 additional pairs are developed within the visceral arches, so that, in all, 6 pairs of aortic arches are formed. The first and second arches pass between the ventral and dorsal aortae, while the others arise at first by a common trunk from the truncus arteriosus, but end separately in the dorsal aortae. As the neck elongates, the ventral aortae are drawn out, and the 3rd and 4th arches arise directly from these vessels. In fishes, these arches persist, and give off branches to the gills, in which the blood is oxygenated. In mammals some of them remain as permanent structures, while others disappear or become obliterated. The anterior ventral aortae. These persist on both sides. The right forms a. the innominate artery, b. the right common and external carotid arteries. The left gives rise to a. the short portion of the aortic arch, which reaches from the origin of the innominate artery to that of the left common carotid artery, b. the left common and external carotid arteries. The aortic arches. The first and second arches disappear early, but the dorsal end of the second gives origin to the stapedial artery, a vessel which atrophies in man but persists in some mammals. It passes through the ring of the stapes and divides into supraorbital, infraorbital, and mandibular branches, which follow the 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve. The infraorbital and mandibular arise from a common stem, the terminal part of which anastomoses with the external carotid. On the obliteration of the stapedial artery, this anastomosis enlarges and forms the internal maxillary artery, and the branches of the stapedial artery are now branches of this vessel. The common stem of the infraorbital and mandibular branches passes between the two roots of the auricular-temporal nerve and becomes the middle meningeal artery. The original supraorbital branch of the stapedial is represented by the orbital twigs of the middle meningeal. The third aortic arch constitutes the commencement of the internal carotid artery, and is, therefore, named the carotid arch. The fourth right arch forms the right subclavian as far as the origin of its internal mammary branch, while the fourth left arch constitutes the arch of the aorta between the origin of the left carotid artery and the termination of the ductus arteriosus. The fifth arch disappears on both sides. The sixth right arch disappears. The sixth left arch gives off the pulmonary arteries and forms the ductus arteriosus. This duct remains pervious during the whole of fetal life, but is obliterated a few days after birth. His showed that in the early embryo the right and left arches each gives a branch to the lungs, but that later both pulmonary arteries take origin from the left arch. The dorsal aortae persist and form the continuations of the internal carotid arteries. These arteries pass to the brain, and each divides into an anterior and a posterior branch, the former giving off the ophthalmic and the anterior and middle cerebral arteries, while the latter turns back and joins the cerebral part of the vertebral artery. Behind the third arch, the right dorsal aorta disappears as far as the point where the two dorsal aortae fuse to form the descending aorta. The part of the left dorsal aorta between the third and fourth arches disappears, while the remainder persists to form the descending part of the arch of the aorta. A constriction, the aortic isthmus, is sometimes seen in the aorta between the origin of the left subclavian and the attachment of the ductus arteriosus. Sometimes the right subclavian artery arises from the aortic arch distal to the origin of the left subclavian and passes upward and to the right behind the trachea and esophagus. This condition may be explained by the persistence of the right dorsal aorta and the obliteration of the fourth right arch. In birds, the fourth right arch forms the arch of the aorta. In reptiles, the fourth arch on both sides persists and gives rise to the double aortic arch in these animals. The heart originally lies on the ventral aspect of the pharynx, immediately behind the stomacheum. With the elongation of the neck and the development of the lungs, it recedes within the thorax, and as a consequence, the anterior ventral aortae are drawn out, and the original position of the fourth and fifth arches is greatly modified. Thus, on the right side, the fourth recedes to the root of the neck, while on the left side it is withdrawn within the thorax. The recurrent nerves originally pass to the larynx under the sixth pair of arches, and are therefore pulled backward with the descent of these structures, so that in the adult the left nerve hooks around the ligamentum arteriosum. Owing to the disappearance of the fifth and the sixth right arches, the right nerve hooks around that immediately above them, i.e., the commencement of the subclavian artery. Segmental arteries arise from the primitive dorsal aortae, and course between successive segments. The seventh segmental artery is of special interest, since it forms the lower end of the vertebral artery, and when the forelimb bud appears, sends a branch to it, the subclavian artery. From the seventh segmental arteries, the entire left subclavian and the greater part of the right subclavian are formed. The second pair of segmental arteries accompany the hypoglossal nerves to the brain, and are named the hypoglossal arteries. Each sends forward a branch which forms the cerebral part of the vertebral artery and anastomoses with the posterior branch of the internal carotid. The two vertebrals unite on the ventral surface of the hindbrain to form the basilar artery.